So what do we mean by the Upstander Ripple Effect?
Stand up against hate and prejudice, even if it does not affect you.
From moral dilemmas in today's headlines, upstanders who rose for justice, and stories of survival.
Be prepared to walk away from this conversation inspired and motivated. I'm Kevin Aldridge.
And I'm Jackie Congedo. Welcome to the Upstander Ripple Effect.
It's July, and this time of year, we think a lot about our country and its leaders. We just celebrated Independence Day, and there's a lot to unpack related to the state of our democracy and the events of the past few weeks. And of course, the way people are drawing connections between current events and significant moments in history.
We're going to talk more about that. But, as we think about what it means to be American, today we have some really terrific stories to share from our survivors and other thought leaders this month to help illustrate that being American, what it means to be patriotic and to be part of this salad bowl / melting pot of a country means something very different to different people.
Yeah, but first we have a bit of news to share with you all today, and it may be one of the worst kept secrets in Cincinnati.
I think for sure.
But we certainly want to congratulate you, Jackie, on your elevation to CEO.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's been a fun last few weeks to just talk with so many people and hear about how committed they are to the work at the Holocaust and Humanities Center, how excited they are about the next chapter and what I know we will do together. And on a personal note, I'll just say that, I think it's the most anticlimactic ascension, really, one, because I've been fortunate to have the opportunity to really learn over the past 2 years from all of our stakeholders and, to really understand where the organization is, where it's headed. But also I feel this, the excitement I have is mixed with this real sense of duty and responsibility for these stories and that are the stories of our most treasured stakeholders, our local survivors and their families, and the consequence of those stories, particularly in this moment.
Yeah.
And so, I'm excited and I am humbled and it's a sort of a very sobering moment for me to think about, we as a team, and it's not me, it's the entire team at the center, which is just a phenomenal, amazing team of passionate, dedicated folks committed to excellence and committed to our mission. We have an important job to do during a time that's really quite unprecedented. And there's lots to do, so we should get to work.
Yeah, well, certainly, again, congratulations. You're the right person for the job. I know your leadership, your vision, your creativity, your passion is going to serve the organization well. So I know I'm a little bit biased in saying this, but it's the truth, and I know there will be nothing but great things ahead.
All right, well, and I have a secret weapon who's always on call to help me anytime I need it, so keep your phone handy, Kevin.
Absolutely.
I'm going to be doing that for sure. So, there's sort of start usually by thinking about how the past and the present merge in our current events and, drilling down on a couple of the topics of the last couple of weeks. It's been a bumpy ride. Mm-hmm. Here in our news cycle over the past few weeks. We have July 4th celebration of our Independence Day, a lot of conversation around, I think, the meaning of that day and what it is to be American and the state of our democracy. And then, just weeks later, less than really weeks later, only a couple of days later, an assassination attempt on a former president, on a current candidate. And sort of the way that inevitably shakes every single person,
yes,
who's paying attention to what's happening. And so there's been a lot of response and reaction to that since then. And I thought it would be good just to spend the first few minutes talking about that, and starting with the fact that it didn't take long before people were making historical references. that are very specific to the chapter of history that we talk about at the center, specifically sort of implicating the Reichstag fire in this moment. And so I thought it'd be worth just sharing a little bit more about what that was.
Yeah.
For those who aren't as familiar with the history. So this was a fire at the Reichstag building, which was the home of the German parliament, which happened about a month after Hitler was sworn in as chancellor to Germany, of Germany in 1933, in January of 1933. And so in February, someone burns down this building, and Hitler seized this moment as an opportunity to cast blame on the communists, and used it as a moment to sort of sow fear and actually as sort of rationale to issue a law decree which stripped away some civil liberties, right?
Yes.
And said, in this moment of upheaval and this attempt at violence, at the center of our country, we need this law in place that inevitably stripped civil liberties, and also provided legal cover for Nazis to imprison people, right? So it was specifically stripping the liberties of folks who opposed the Nazi Party and also providing legal cover to imprison people. So we look back historically on this, and there's sort of a recognition by historians that this moment, this fire, was key to the rise in Nazi power. And so it was a consequential moment, and using that implication right now has consequences.
Yes.
So, it wasn't long before, I think almost immediately, we started seeing swirls of, this moment of the attempted assassination is the Reichstag fire of our time, right? And what's that going to do? And all this speculation about. And so I just wanted to spend a few minutes talking about the difference between comparisons and lessons from history.
Sure. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you and I have talked about this, many, many times. And one of the problems that I have is that we too often jump to sort of these historical comparisons to try to draw parallels to things that are happening currently. And I get why it's tempting to do that. But I think in many ways, we sometimes wind up making false equivalencies, and even in some ways minimizing or even diminishing the significance of of the past historical events that we're referencing. And so my thing has always been, hey, in moments that we have, the attempted assassination of a former president is a historic moment in and of itself that doesn't necessarily require us to compare it to anything. Why can't we just talk about what we are experiencing here and now, how people are feeling about it here and now? What are the ramifications that it's having here and now, as opposed to the immediate jumping to comparing it to something else, without the recognition that times are different, that people are different, that institutions and everything around us are different, that we're not living in the same times as it was, back then. So I think your point is well taken, that there's a difference between looking at history, being aware of it, and learning lessons from it, without trying to necessarily equate something that is happening in the here and now and saying this is exactly like this thing here. Because first of all, Donald Trump is not in power at present. He doesn't have the ability to do anything right now. So to say that somehow or another, he hasn't been elected yet as president. So to immediately jump to, hey, this is the Reichstag fire moment for him. Well, maybe if he were president, but last I checked, Joe Biden was sitting in the White House, and I don't think we have to worry about him taking away anybody's civil liberties over this particular moment. Now, maybe, it's something to be aware of, maybe something to keep an eye out on if Trump does wind up winning, and seeing if there is any steps that he takes as a result of this. But as of right now, in this moment, that's not even an applicable comparison because there's nothing that Donald Trump can do in this moment to affect any change on anything as it relates to that. So that's just one small example. The other downside of that is if you listen to the critics on the right, and we'll get into this here in just a minute about the rhetoric and how maybe some of the rhetoric may have led to this. If you listen to folks on the right, they're saying that part of the reason perhaps why this guy might have taken a shot at Trump is because of these assertions that folks on the left have been making about him being this existential threat, likening him to Hitler. And so again, drawing these comparisons to that feeds into exactly what some people on the right are saying about the rhetoric and what they say are unfair characterizations of Donald Trump, no matter how strongly you might feel about that on the other side. So making those comparisons only feeds into the argument about the rhetoric that might have led to a situation like that. And so I think we just have
Turns up the temperature. For sure.
So I think we have to take a step back and look and say, are we being responsible when we're making these comparisons? I mean, to even suggest, there were things going around that suggested that despite there being no evidence to support this, but that somehow this was something that Trump staged, that he set up, that for maybe some of the nefarious reasons that are even implicated in a statement like that. And so I think we just have to be careful about what we say, how we make comparisons. Are they evidence-based? And do we really take the time to say, could it be similar?
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah.
But it's not the same.
Right. Yeah. I think, the points around trivializing the history and the implications of the history. We always say the only thing that is like the Holocaust is the Holocaust. Period. And so the minute you start throwing comparisons in a way that implicates or that, sort of leverages that sort of parallel comparison, it's like a real minefield, and it's insulting and, degrading to people who actually survived the history and who were impacted by the magnitude of that history. And at the same time, to your point, it detracts from the real conversations that we should be having today about the problems of today and how we need to fix them. And so I don't think it's helpful on either side. Now, I will say, as an organization whose mission is to ensure the lessons of history inspire action today, we're not living in the past, right? We are grounded firmly in the current and in the future, related to how we think about the past, to help us make sense of and sort of inform how we think about some of, the echoes, should I say. Like, it's not that history, people say history, well, if we don't learn from history, it will repeat itself.
Right.
And the reality is that history doesn't repeat itself. It echoes. And so, absolutely, we must learn from history to understand what went wrong, what trends were happening, how was there an environment that was created where the worst of humanity could prevail at such magnitude like that? The role of rhetoric, the role of propaganda, the role of polarization, dehumanization, these themes that are not new themes.
Right.
They weren't new in the 1930s. They're not new today.
Absolutely.
We should use the history to help us look out for those things. But to make these kind of pointed, parallel, this is that comparisons only adds to a climate of fear.
Absolutely. And that's a thread that goes through across time, and how we see how a lot of these things are able to be put into place and be executed, right? It is very much the fear factor and what it is that we're afraid of. Fear of history repeating itself can be something that, if you aren't careful through your actions, you can wind up creating the future that you say you don't want. Yep. And I think we have to be very careful about that we don't become so afraid that we wind up doing things or thinking in ways that are not in our best interests. I thought back to after 9/11, right? Certainly a historic tragedy in the history of our country. And what was much of the conversation that came in the aftermath of that was, what were we going to do here in America to ensure that we never suffered such an attack again? And there were a lot of conversations about security and listening in on people's phone calls and all of these different things in the interest of creating a more secure society. And there were some folks who were going to be perfectly okay with giving away some civil liberties in the event or in exchange for greater safety. And so I think that is the type of thing that fear can create, to the point of where we become so afraid that people are willing to give up freedoms and liberty in the interest of stopping the thing that they don't want to have happen to them again. And I think that we're in that delicate space now of, if we don't get a handle on our fear of the future, that we don't wind up creating the future that we say we don't want by putting systems in place that do take away our liberties and freedoms, and doing it willingly. I mean, when we talk about the Reichstag fire, like, people gave those were civil liberties that, Hitler manipulated it, but he was able to manipulate it through fear, that people were okay with saying, we think this is a good idea.
For those people.
Yes.
For those people.
Yeah. Right.
Because it was about political dissidents and opposition and many others. And I think fear is a powerful motivator. It might be the most powerful motivator, and it is sort of the it's this silver bullet for demagogues. Like it's the kind of thing that once you start hitting at people's, because it's neurological, right? It's like, once you start hitting at people's fight or flight mechanism, and your safety is compromised and you should be afraid, it puts us in a whole different neurological gear. And we can't access the part of our brains that allow us to actually think critically, that allow us to think with context. And again, to think responsibly about, have we been here in some ways before? Am I hearing any echoes? It puts us in like a binary mindset, and we're not in our rational minds when we're afraid, right? So, I think that part of what's really important, I think, for all of us to be doing right now is just checking in with ourselves. Am I operating out of a mindset of fear? Am I operating out of my like limbic brain, my primitive hardwiring? Or, and if I am, then at least I'm aware of that.
Right.
Before I go making some consequential decisions or comments on Facebook or whatever, is that going to be helpful? Or should I give myself some time to sit in the fear that I have, process through that, and then get into a place of decision making when I actually have access to rational thought again? Which seems like a patronizing thing to say. I'm really just saying, we all feel that. Like that's the truth.
It is. Yeah. I mean, I went through this whole process of thinking about, how do I process things when I become afraid, or when I have fear. And I always say our fear is intensified a lot by the unknown. So a lack of information. So when we have a lack of information, or when we're uncertain and we don't know, that exacerbates our fear. It really gets it churning. It's the thing around the corner that we can't see that terrifies us the most. The thing that's under our bed, that's in our closet.
Right.
But the remedy to that is when you shine light on it. Any kid who's afraid of the dark, you pop the light on, they're instantly not afraid anymore. Light represents, to me, information, knowledge, trying to fill your head with good, solid data. And so when I find myself becoming afraid of things, I do the process of doing research or information gathering, trying to fill myself with information that helps me process my fear, to help me understand, is this a rational fear, right? Because there are some fears that are absolutely rational, that even when you get information, it might even make you more afraid, right? Like the more you know, like, oh, wow, this is...
Yeah, you're looking and there's sharks in the pool. And the more you look, the more sharks there are. Don't jump in the pool. That's useful information.
Absolutely. So... But again, having the information helps you figure out how to navigate and deal with the fear better, versus I'm afraid and I don't even know what to do with it. So I think we've got to, as you said, check in when we feel ourselves being afraid, asking yourself, why am I afraid? And if it is because I don't understand what's going on or I feel powerless in a situation, understand what the root of that is and then try to deal with that. If it's a lack of information and knowledge, educate yourself. If it's a sense of powerlessness, start to think about what
Where
it
you
is
have
that
agency.
you, what it is that you can do to give yourself a sense of empowerment to the point where that will help you mitigate that. But just sitting in the fear and allowing that to just kind of soak in and continuing to operate in that irrational part of our brains, that's what we've got to fight against.
Yeah. And listening to you talk about how you, like your response, what occurs to me is we have this framework that we use, we talk about a lot, are the VIA character strengths, right? And there's 24 character strengths. And, you know, in our conversations leading up to this, Kevin, we were talking about like, what is the opposite of fear? And you had said courage, bravery.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, bravery is one of the 24 character strengths. But as I was actually listening to you talk, your response to fear is actually pursuit of knowledge. And that is another strength, actually, appreciation of beauty and excellence. And there's the wisdom strength. It's within the wisdom category of virtue, which is learning, love of learning. And so, and then I was thinking about, you know, creativity. Somebody could respond with creativity to a sense of fear. Somebody could respond with kindness to a sense of fear. Somebody might respond with judgment to a sense of fear. So I actually think that the secret weapon to fear is thinking about where you're positioned,
Yes.
what your assets are, and trying to get yourself in a place where you can operate from a place of strength.
Yes.
In an environment that is all too often riddled with inputs that drive fear. So I want to just share two things. First of all, that I've been thinking a lot about our survivor community in the last couple. I mean, I think about them all the time, but I've been thinking a lot about them in the last few weeks. And, you know, as they're watching these comparisons be hurled around, and, you know, I just picture them kind of sitting watching this take place and having actually lived it. And then, you know, I was thinking about this idea of bravery and courage and operating from a sense of strength. And we're going to hear from one of our survivors here in a minute, Al Miller. But I was thinking about, man, like the hope that we all have to find a way to access right now. For me, all I have to do is think about the way these people who came here after experiencing the worst case scenario, right? The absolute worst of humanity. The fact that they came here with a sense of hope and resilience and perseverance through that darkness is just, it fills up my cup every time when I think about that, you know, because and it's so grounding to speak with any of them, because it's like, it's okay. Like we will move through this. We will move through all of this, and dark times come, and we lean into our strengths. We maintain hope. We persevere. And so, and the audacity to have hope in a time when things seem really dark, is something I think that's a real gift that we have from our survivor community, and in watching them model this.
Yeah. I've said that, you know, you don't survive without hope and courage. You don't become a survivor unless you possess those traits.
Yeah.
Now, there are a lot of people who had hope and courage who didn't survive.
Right.
But you have no chance of survival without hope and courage in dark times and in dark situations. It's what keeps you going. It's what keeps you fighting. It's what allows you to move versus staying put, right? Like sometimes when we talk about fear, when we become afraid, it's hard to move, right? We don't want to move.
Paralyzed,
We want to, there's safety in somehow or another, a sense of feeling like staying where you are when you're afraid. But sometimes staying where you are is the thing that can get you killed. You know, if you're in a severe storm, they tell you wherever you are, move.
Get
you
out
got
of
to
the way.
move.
Get out of the way.
You got to get to a place of safety. If you stay where you are, your chances of survival kind of diminish a little bit.
Yeah,
So,
and I think it's worth sort of like adding to that, you know, in this history, and I know this is sort of what you're saying, there were so many, you know, the victims and the survivors. There were no choices. I mean, there were really no choices.
Right.
And so the reality is that for those who did survive, and many of them will say, you know, how did you survive? Well, there some did and some didn't. Like, it wasn't
Right.
to my credit or anyone else's discredit. But I will say that, you know, when they came here to this city and what they did with that traumatic history, that's a deliberate choice. And that's a choice that was grounded in a sense of hope and resilience. And so, you know, speaking about the chapter of history where people were so terribly dehumanized and victimized, is hard to say there were choices there. But speaking about the aftermath and the fact that these incredible human beings, after being treated so horrifically, made the choice to be hopeful, and to see the best in people.
absolutely.
And I mean, that's the museum, right? That they built this space where that is the mission, is really something that gives me a lot of hope. And practicing that can actually, we actually have a expert coming on in another few weeks in a future episode, who talks about how you can cultivate hope, how, you know, scientifically, neurologically, from a body chemistry standpoint, if you do a certain number of things routinely, that actually can cultivate hopefulness in your brain. So for those of us who say, like, well, that's not a strength of mine, I don't have it, I'm not getting hopeful anytime soon, we all actually can cultivate it.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
Stay
Well,
tuned for that.
And I think you raise the word you said there was choice. And I think that's the thing that we all have to wrap around and embrace in our minds. We have a choice. We have a choice to be hopeful or not. We have a choice to exchange and deal in the rhetoric or not.
Yep.
You know, these are all choices that we make. And I always say we have a tendency to want to shift blame to other people. Oh, so-and-so did this. But it's like we all have a choice. You know, it's like sometimes when I listen to some of the things that our political leaders say, and the people in the crowd might not be saying exactly that same thing, but they're saying something when they applaud for certain lines, right? Like, that's a choice. Like, you have a choice when you hear somebody say something
How are you going to respond?
that's offensive or that's improper. You have a choice there, regardless of whether that's your person or not. You have a choice to say, you know what, I didn't agree with what they just said there, so I'm not going to applaud for that,
Yeah.
you know, because that's not an applause worthy line. And so I think we have to take more seriously the choices and how each of us are playing into this. You know, in the aftermath of the shooting, people on both sides of the aisle immediately went to the blame game. Like, whose fault is this? Like, this is the left was saying this, and this is the reason why, you know, Trump was shot at. And there was sort of like no acknowledgement of the things that, you know, the former president has said himself that may have, you know, engendered the type of ill feelings that might want to make somebody take a shot at him. Again, I'm not saying that that's an excuse, but I'm saying that there seems to be a reluctance on both sides to sort of take a look at, how am I contributing to the climate?
Yeah, it's much easier to point the finger.
Yeah. And am I being reactive? You know, am I being petty? Am I being, you know, am I so filled with fear, anger, and hate that I'm not even taking an inventory of myself and how I'm looking and how I'm showing up in the world in these times? And is that who I want to be? Is that how I want to represent myself? Because I guarantee you, in a private moment, if you got with most people, they wouldn't want to show up the way that they sometimes show up on social media or present themselves on social media or wherever they might catch them not at their best. I don't believe that that's how most of us, if we were in an interview and we were being asked who we were and how we wanted to show up, it wouldn't be that person. And I think, again, those are the times where we have to pause, sort of check ourselves and say, how am I actually showing up? Is this consistent with who I want to be and who I say that I am? And if that's you, okay, great. Sometimes, you know, you kind of are who you are, right?
Yeah.
And that's that may be just what it is. But if you're saying to yourself that that's not me and that's not who I am, then how do you reconcile how you're showing up in these places with who you believe yourself to be?
Yeah, and things can be subtle. I mean, so I want to get to this first story we're going to hear from today from our archives. And this was a moment of choice that was a pretty subtle moment. I actually don't even know if the person who made the choice, if you could find them, or if they're still alive today, or their descendants, they would probably have no memory of this choice that they made, because it's seemingly that inconsequential and routine for them. And this was a moment of choice that happened right outside the Statue of Liberty at Ellis Island. So one of our most beloved, I mean, all of them are so beloved, but certainly a real cornerstone of our mission, Dr. Al Miller, who we recently lost at the age of 100 years old, incredible life and legacy, who came here to this country after fleeing Europe with his family. And he was a teenager at the time, I believe. And so he arrives at Ellis Island with his parents and his family, and he realizes that he has forgotten his papers. And this is after a very long journey of hopping throughout Europe, country to country, because it was almost impossible to find refuge at that point. And there was a series of basically miracles that happened that allowed his family to get out by the skin of their teeth every step of the way. And it was, again, from country to country where they weren't wanted and where, they weren't allowed in. And then finally they get to this country, and he gets there, and there are the gates, and there's no papers in his pocket. And so Al talks about this in this clip, and I think it's a great window into gratitude and hope. And it's also a great window into choices and the choice of that immigration official and his response. So let's listen.
We look at the Statue of Liberty. Is it real? Can there really be hope for us? By that time, I'd lived in 5 countries over a period of 3.5 years. That's how long it took to come to the United States. I'd lived in Switzerland, in Belgium, in Holland, and in England. In Germany, of course. And none of those countries was I welcome. Now here, the Statue of Liberty. How would our arrival be greeted in the United States? We weren't so sure. We were hoping, symbolized by the Statue of Liberty. Okay, so we arrive in New York, and the immigration officer establishes himself in one of the cabins. Everybody goes through that. Eventually our turn comes. This is the first real American that I had seen, ever. And I wonder if they all looked like that. He had... What did I say? What kind of a hat he had on?
A straw hat, right?
A straw hat, flat straw hat. Yeah, okay. And the shirt open down to hair, cigarette dangling in his mouth, feet on the desk. Very, very informal, very, very polite, very, very nice. And it turned out helpful. And we were not used to that from any official in any country in Europe, none whatsoever. They were all boom, boom, boom. This one? Okay. So he says, may I have your papers, please? My parents give him their papers and passports, whatever was needed. And he said everything is fine. And my brother's turn comes, and here it is. It's the papers and the passport. Everything is fine. My turn comes. My papers, please. I reach here, reach here, reach here, reach here. I don't have them. Who took them? Why are they? Where are they? Where could they possibly be? I tell you, panic sets in quickly and powerfully. If my mother's looks could kill, I wouldn't be here now. And my mother was good at that. So this official, of course, sees all this, and he talks to me and says, Sonny, relax. in the excitement, you probably left all that in your cabin. Go to your cabin, you will find it, and bring it to me. In the meantime, I'll take care of your family. I run to the cabin. He was right. I found him under some other things, and I bring him to the official again. He says, here it is. And he signs what he needs to sign. I sign what I need to sign. We're ready to go. And he stops us, and he talks to me. And then again, this is one of the things that I probably will not forget. I'm not so sure about that anymore, but I hope I will not forget. And this is what he says: Sonny, you are now in a free country. You are in the United States of America. Make something of yourself. Get an education. Obey our laws. And if you do all that, we will be grateful to you that you came to live with us. Let me tell you, by contrast with all these other officials that we had run across, this man is a miracle. He's not real. And so, I don't know what to say to him. And the time has come to leave, and we left. And did he say anything else? No.
No, but you talk about how that sentence made an impact on your life. How did that sentence impact you? That simple sentence.
How did it impact me? It made a huge difference. If they're all like that in the United States, what could go wrong?
That's the power of choices.
Yeah.
Right? One choice.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much.
Changed his whole life.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much to take away from Al's story. First of all, I mean, you can't help but love him. I mean, I just love the way he told that story. And you got to think how impactful that was for a guy who's in his 90s, remembering in vivid detail the story that happened. Yeah, that happened to him in his teenage years.
Yeah.
Let you know how impactful that moment was.
Yes.
That in a man who's had a very full life, that sticks out in his mind more than anything. I'll try to be quick on this because there's just so much I took from that. But I think Al's story exemplifies the complexity of America. And I'll just go through the things that ran through my mind as I listened to him talk. Lived in 5 other countries, not welcome there. He comes to America, he sees the Statue of Liberty, and he feels everything that I'm sure the founders of this country wanted people to feel when they came to America. Hope, acceptance, a sense of possibility. No matter where you came from, no matter how bad it was someplace else, that when you come to America, there's a chance, right? And so he's feeling all of that, and he has this encounter with this immigration official that could have gone very badly, to be honest. I mean, if you get a different type of person there, when he forgets his papers, I mean, just imagine how differently it would have been if you'd have had someone who was less tolerant or who didn't suggest that he goes back. Or even if he does go back, and what if he still can't find his papers? Like, what does that mean for him and his family? So that could have gone a lot of different ways. But fortunately for him, he got a really kind, helpful individual who, was willing to help him work through that. And again, this individual, he's probably seeing hundreds of people coming through here, and he probably isn't even thinking anything about this interaction beyond what it was, but it meant so much to Al, and he's thinking like, are all Americans that way? Well, we know they're not, right? We know all Americans are not that way. And as we found out that he experienced this later on in his life, that there's some good people here and there's some not so good people here. And that is part of the complexity of what being an American is and what America is. It's a deeply personal thing that's built into our experiences. Mm-hmm. Because as an African American, I couldn't help but think, that the hope and promise that Al felt when he was coming here, the sense of welcoming. There were people who looked like me who didn't feel that sense of welcome, who in fact weren't even able to enjoy some of the freedoms and liberties that someone who was not like Al, who was not even born here, would be able to enjoy in coming here from someplace else. And so when we talk about how someone like Al Miller might view America and his sense of what it means to be American, is very different from that of an African American who, for many years, did not have the exposure to that liberty and that acceptance as a citizen of this country. And so when we wonder
just
why,
the recognition of humanity, of the humanity.
Absolutely. And so when you think about, well, why is it that African Americans, it's not that we don't love this country, right? But there's a different way in how that relationship is because of the deeply personal experience that we've had. And I think that when we try to impose our sense of what America is or what it means to be American on others, I think it discounts what our experience is. I'm not taking anything away from Al Miller and his experience and what it meant for him, because that was very real for him. You could see it in the video. He felt, even all these many years later, he felt that. You could tell he felt that in his bones. And I have a respect for that and an appreciation for that. And I can understand why he would feel that given where he's coming from. I think a lot of times you got to extend that same sense of empathy and try to understanding when you hear the stories of other people's whose experience with America has been different.
Who were not welcome.
Yeah.
And who were who have been dehumanized throughout history and today.
Yes.
And when you talk about the experience of other people and what it is to be an American, it is so many moments of small choices that create that different relationship.
For sure.
It's not a predetermined thing, right? Although we do certainly are at the mercy and sort of suffer from systems that make that too often the default. But it is how we go about our day-to-day life and treat each other in the individual choices. Those are all possible turning points for people.
Absolutely.
And so, I think it's a really important sort of contextual awareness that this isn't everyone's experience.
Yeah.
And that who creates the experience?
Yeah.
Who creates the experience? We all create that for each other.
Absolutely. I mean, just kindness, right? Like this guy, this official was kind. Kindness is not something that it takes a lot. Right? It doesn't take a lot.
He didn't think twice about it, I
don't
think. I mean, not to discredit him, but I'm sure this was just, he's over there stamping documents and he's like, all right, you know what? Family goes, this was his nature. This was his strength.
Yeah. And he had, and again, it was kind of like if you listen to Al's description, everywhere else he had been, people were just very much about the system and protocol and doing things by the book and just very uptight. Very, very uptight. Yeah. And he talked about how, this American was kind of pretty laid back,
feet up on the table.
And was just saying, hey, I know this is how it's supposed to go, but you know what? Go back to your cabin, take a look. You probably left it there. Just a very kind, simplistic thing. If this had been a, by the book kind of guy, he could have made that a very hard and memorable experience for him in a different way, in a much negative way. But because of the kindness that he showed, the compassion, the patience, to be able to send him on to back, look for it while he takes care of his parents. All of those are small things that most of the time, day to day, we don't give a second thought to, but it can mean the world to somebody else.
Yeah. And there are also things that actually, we talk about like they're all choices, but sometimes the choices happen without us even being conscious of them. Right. So this is where bias comes into play, right? And so the same person who's going to extend that kindness without thinking to some person who looks like this might not extend that kindness to someone else who looks different because it triggers, without them even being conscious of it, a biased response and reaction, and that informs the choice. So I think it's worth really kind of sitting with and thinking about and realizing that today in our interactions, wherever you go off to today after we, finish this, whatever I do, we're going to make a lot of choices.
Yeah.
And some of them are going to be more conscious than others. And we should just be aware of the fact that a turning point like what happened to Al is possible for us in our lives today, and for us to have influence on other people in their lives in that way. And maybe what happens with us, in the next, before the sun sets today, could be the moment that someone later recounts 90 years later and says, that changed my life.
Yeah. So here's the calculation that we sometimes make, because we do make decisions on whether to be kind and compassionate to people based on a couple of like, it should be a reflex, like kindness and compassion should be how we operate. But a lot of times we base that on who we feel like deserves it, or what are they going to do?
It's how we're conditioned. I think a lot of that is implicit.
Right. What are they going to do with my kindness? If I give this, this panhandler on the street a couple bucks, what's he going to do? Is he going to go drink it up, or is he actually going to go get a sandwich? It's like, those are the calculations that we go through, but we really shouldn't. If we're going to be kind, be kind. It shouldn't matter whether you feel like, exactly. And I think that's how we get around those biases and trying to figure out, like, in reality, everybody deserves to be kind, to have kindness extended to them, even if they abuse it. But what about the person who is waiting on somebody to just show them kindness and it changes their life, and you could be that person? So I think we've got to get out of this mentality of where we start, judging who deserves kindness and who doesn't based on whatever criteria, and just operate from that, and yes, there are going to be folks who are going to run roughshod over our kindness, but that doesn't diminish what you did in any way.
Right.
It shouldn't.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that, the next person we're going to hear from is, his name is Eric Ward. He's an expert in sort of the dynamics of Black communities, Jewish communities, the intersection of those things, the allyship dynamics. But I was thinking about the fact that, like, this idea of bias, and the consciousness that we think about in terms of how we choose to deploy kindness. Mm-hmm. This is something I think that, like, people who have suffered marginalization in some form or another on the basis of their identity really understand the implications of, because they have been the victims of the lack of consciousness or of the bias that comes out, or in some cases hate that comes out. And, African Americans, Jewish communities, these are two communities that deeply, painfully, personally understand the implications of bias and hatred. Mm-hmm. And that has led us down shared paths in allyship with each other throughout history. And it's been, a path that's been smooth and amazing at some points, and deeply bumpy and turbulent at other points.
Sure.
And, we're in this moment now, which is why we're so fortunate to have Eric, who can sort of shed some light on this, where it's a little bumpy. I mean, it's been bumpy, I think, for a little while. And particularly in the wake of, some of sort of the seismic upheaval we've seen in our world and in our communities in the last, 4 or 5 years. You think about, the murder of George Floyd and sort of this, like, racial justice reawakening. You think about the skyrocketing of antisemitism and some of these watershed events, including, what we saw on October 7th and sort of the response to that. And so you and I got the chance to sit down with Eric, who, as I said, is an expert on the intersections of antisemitism and racism and sort of the Black and Jewish experience, and this idea of allyship and diverse coalition and its role in a democratic society. And so he, we got to sit down and talk to him about how's he navigating this as someone who sits at the intersection of all of this in a terribly difficult moment post October 7th. So let's have a listen to what he has to say. I'd love to hear you speak, Eric, a little bit about what your life has been like since October 7th, being in this work at the intersection of Black and Jewish communities, the intersection of racism and anti-Semitism, watching a deeply painful tear is what it's felt like on my end watching it. What has that been like?
I mean, not only painful, but I would argue dangerous, right?
Yeah,
and we should unpack this. I think before I unpack it, I almost want to take a step back and just say, one of the things that I think of George Floyd, or I think of other moments of Black horror in America.
Yeah.
And I think the Jewish community, right, those in Gaza, right, want to hear exactly what anyone else would want to hear in this kind of moment, which is, it is horrifying, and I'm sorry that that happened, right, to your community. And we weren't hearing that in that moment. Now, I'm not saying it wasn't being said, but it wasn't the story that was being told.
Yeah.
The story that was being told was not one of understanding the deep loss, the triggering horror, right, that meant for the Jewish community. What was being told was a different narrative, and I think that was quite a loss in that moment. That's what folks wanted to hear. That's what they deserved to hear, and it's what they needed to hear in that moment. And it was not a message that was given. It's not surprising in that moment then that people would turn inward into silo. You're not hearing from your friends and colleagues and allies the thing that is most important, right? That the idea of the fundamental right to exist. And that's a deep and painful place and an isolating place to be. We know that in smaller scales. I know what it was like to walk through the world after the killing of George Floyd and not know what folks might say or if they would show up or how they would show up. And so I think it's important to hold. That was a deeply painful moment in U.S. social change and in the American public. To understand October 7th and its ramifications in the United States, we almost have to start with a premise, right? I'm not going to ask folks to automatically accept this premise, but to just kind of wrestle with it in curiosity. It is a premise that white nationalists neither create anti-Semitism or Islamophobia, right, or anti-Arab racism, nor do they bring it into our communities. They merely tap into the unconscious bias that already exists, meaning we walk around with those biases. Now, that doesn't make us a Louis Farrakhan or a David Duke, right? It just means we walk around with biases as human beings. And in moments of stress and high emotion, we tend to fall back into those biases without even knowing it, right? Wow. And I think that was a moment, October 7th, for the tragedy and then the horror of what we understood would come, right, from that horror. I think also was a moment where too many doubled down first into unconscious bias.
Yeah.
And because we didn't have an understanding of anti-Semitism or Islamophobia, anti-Arab racism, we became defensive, right, when other folks began to point out, right, these biases in our memes or things we might be saying. But I think the real other danger in that moment was it wasn't really the Jewish community and the Palestinian community in the United States talking to each other, or the Arab community and the Jewish community talking to each other. It was really everyone else talking for those two communities, right? And to me, that was a betrayal of values, right? In a way that I have not seen around other issues.
You know, I think Eric kind of hits at, like, you know, these communities, whether we talk about the Black community, the Jewish community, the Muslim community, these are communities that have sat together around common shared tables for many years over shared interest. Mm-hmm. And so the question he was posing is like, why was this moment so different? Where was the allyship? Where were the voices? Where was the support? Where were people just to reach out and say, hey, you all right?
Yeah.
It's terrible. What happened is just terrible. And I think part of the challenge is that, in community relations, like, one of the founding sort of guiding principles of community relations is, you don't build relationships. You don't deal with hard things in the fire.
Mm-hmm.
You have to deal with the hard things outside of the fire.
Yeah.
And I think we've done a really good job as communities of showing up for each other, when there's a shared interest. There's a self-interest, and that self-interest aligns.
Right.
And I think that, we've been content to just let the other stuff be.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens when the other stuff is just left to be is there's not education happening. There's not deepened allyship that's happening. And inevitably those things come up. And that's what we saw on October 7th, right? There was this seismic moment that was it was received so differently depending on who you were, what your identity was, what your lived experience was. And these tables of allyship, the Jewish community felt like, hello, where is everyone?
Mm-hmm.
I know the Muslim community felt the same way. And I think that, folks in other identities, other communities, Black and otherwise,
Yeah.
probably were just also kind of confused about what do I say, what's going on here, because the tackling of those things had not really happened. The education wasn't there. The tough conversations had not been had.
Right.
And then I think, as Eric said, everybody jumped to their silos and said, well, again, in a moment of fear, well, it's because of this. I'm gonna assume, make some assumptions about why I didn't hear from any of my friends on this. And I think we've seen play out that some of those assumptions were somewhat warranted. Some weren't. Some weren't.
Yeah, I think, just looking at it and looking at the dynamics, I think, as you said, there was a gentleman, a radio talk show guy named Joe Madison, and he always used to have this saying is that there are no permanent friends or enemies, only permanent interests, right? And so when I heard you say the word interests, that when our interests align, right, we can be in allyship, we can be in fellowship, but when our interests don't align, that's where the relationships can sort of break down. So whether you're Black, Muslim, or Jew, you can look at certain purveyors of hate and you can see that as a common enemy, and that's something that we can unite around because those interests align. LGBTQ communities, hate is a common thing that generally mostly minority and marginalized communities can rally around. In fact, I think locally here we have the Coalition Against Hate, right? Like that's a common thing. But what happens when people within that dynamic have conflicts against each other, right? And I think that's what we're seeing with the Muslim and the Jewish community on October 7th, is that we can work together against a common enemy, but how do we deal with the issues that we have with each other? And when that flares up, what is that? That has the potential to destroy everything that we
worked on
built
together. Yeah, that's I think what Eric's saying is like, he talked about how this is like, yes, this moment was painful, but also dangerous. Yeah. Like what happens when these coalitions are disrupted possibly beyond repair?
Yeah, absolutely.
And the work that they must do in a functioning democracy, right?
Absolutely. And then I think, the other thing that Eric said that I can understand, but I also think is another thing that you've got to look at in terms of allyship is who do we allow to be a part of the conversation at the table?
Yeah.
So it's sort of like if only Jews and only Muslims can talk about what happened on October 7th, if they say, well, if the attitude is that the only people that can venture an opinion are people who have skin in the game, so to speak, and everybody else's opinion is irrelevant, right? Or maybe not irrelevant, but it just doesn't hold the same kind of weight. And all we want our allies to do is just kind of show up for us and say, oh, we feel bad for you, right? That creates a scenario of not true allyship, because then your only expectation for me is to come in and sort of validate your sense of hurt and pain. Well, what happens when I have two friends who are fighting against each other and I care about both of them and I feel both of their pain, right?
Yeah.
Which I think is where a lot of people are. So we've got to figure out a way in our allyship that not when you and I have conflict that you and I don't talk about it, but who do we allow in to kind of help us that we educate, right?
Yeah.
And then allow them to kind of help us work through it. And so I think that allyship has to be more than sometimes the narrow view of what we paint it as. Are we going to be true allies, or are we just going to only kind of try to show up for each other for
when it's mutually convenient?
Exactly. And so I think this whole notion of what allyship and relationship looks like needs to be redefined. And this it might not be the ideal time, but it may be a really good time to begin to take a look at that and really say, like, how do we tackle the really, really tough issues and have the tough conversations that we need to have in the interest of trying to strengthen our alliances. And there may be times where those conversations get difficult, and it may seem like those conversations can derail what we're trying to build. But I think the true leaders have an obligation in our community to stay at the table. Like, if you're leading any one of these potential groups, you cannot walk away from the table.
Yep.
That is the charge of leadership, is you got to hang in there.
You got to do the hard work on both sides.
Absolutely. So
your people and the folks who are at the table with you.
Yeah. And so I think as our
very
individual
hard, very
communities,
lonely work.
Absolutely. And I think in our individual communities, as we're selecting our leaders and figuring out who's going to lead our organizations, one of the things is, does that person have the capacity
to hold both those things?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and that's actually, I think, what's so fundamentally broken in the incentive system around leadership is that it's about self-gratification. It's about people saying, did they make me feel good all the time? Did they validate me? Whereas people don't recognize that for someone to be a good leader for your cause requires them to sit at a table with people who don't agree with them and to have to do the hard work of actually governing and leading, which is finding common ground, which is playing devil's advocate, which is forcing sort of the conversation around hard truths. And that's going to look different, right? And if they're doing a good job as a leader, they're doing that across the table, and they're doing that at home too.
Absolutely.
And that's like I said, it's incredibly lonely because it's a recipe for everybody hates you. You know, like no one thinks you're working in their best interest, because but what people should trust is that if you have put your faith in someone who has who has character, right, and judgment,
right,
and who has demonstrated that they have your values and they have your back, then give them the space to do the hard work of leadership.
Yeah, and so me being a big sports fan, I see this all the time, right? Like, people will hate coaches or general managers who make moves in the moment, cut their favorite player, won't pay this guy, you know, all of these different things. But at the end of the day, when they raise that championship trophy,
they're the hero.
You may that coach or that person may be ridiculed throughout the process, but when the trophy is raised, all of that goes out of the window.
Yeah.
So I think what leaders have to understand is if you believe in what you're doing and you have a conviction in the road that where you're taking the people that you're leading is going to lead to, for lack of a better word, championships.
Yeah, a trophy.
You got to be willing to take the slings and arrows, because at the end of the day,
long game.
Yeah, it is. And too often in politics and in community relations, we're too worried about the short game. You know, we don't have enough long game thinkers. And if we're ever going to get out of this mode of doing what's expedient or what's popular with the political winds, we've got to develop leaders who have vision and conviction in those visions, who are willing to play the long game, who are willing to get beat up. And it's tough. Everybody's not built for it. That's why I say, like, when we choose our leaders, we have to really be able to say, is this person
Resilience.
built for this?
Yeah,
Because
resilience.
everybody's not. And so and if you're not built that way, don't seek that leadership, right? If you
Right.
know in your heart you're not built, if you're thin-skinned, you can't take the hits, don't even venture down that path. Spare us all the years of wasted leadership. We need resilient individuals who are going to stay at the table, who can take the hits, who have vision, who have a long game vision, because that's what's going to get us where we need to be.
Yeah. I mean, I just want to give credit to Eric, because I really, as I look out there at, who are the bridges, who are the people who are holding so many competing truths, so many competing identities, so many competing, sort of community dynamics at once. Like, he's at the top of my list.
Yeah.
And so like I said, so often, those folks are not celebrated. So as we think about upstanders in our world and the ripple effect of upstanding, shout out to Eric Ward, who has been doing this work long before we were really talking about it.
Absolutely.
And is still doing it, is still at the table. He's still there, and he's probably taken all kinds of heat from all sides in moments like this. So, here's to the bridge builders. And
Absolutely.
and the
Brilliant guy, and someone who really, I think, listens and kind of takes in and thinks critically, right? Like Eric doesn't ask you to accept the premises that he puts out. He just challenges you to think about what
be
he
curious
puts out
about
there.
this. Just be curious.
Think differently.
He says that. He's actually said that.
Yeah.
He said, I don't want to, I'm just gonna put this out there for us to be curious about.
Yeah. And I admire that about Eric. And I think that if more of us could move off of our absolutism, right, and open our minds a little bit more to the possibilities that maybe I could be wrong, or maybe I'm not looking at this from
I'm missing something here.
The value of other perspective. Somebody gave me a really good example the other day. I can't take credit for this, but it's like, you and I are sitting here looking at each other, and how I see you is my perception of where we are.
Yep.
But there are things going on behind me that I can't see, on the side of me that, I'm only catching out of the peripheral. So my perception is what's right in front of me, right? But I don't have all of the information going on around me to adequately assess what my situation actually is.
Right.
So the only thing that can help me with that
That's where allies come in.
I've got to get your perspective. So Jackie, what do you see that I'm not seeing in the space that we're in right now?
Yeah.
What is our camera crew seeing that I can't see, or only marginally see out of my peripheral? And then once I take in your perspective with their perspective and add it to my own perception, then that's how I begin to come up with a more educated, a more well-rounded view of what's actually going on in the situation that I'm in. Too often we only go with our perception, and that becomes our reality. So that's just a way to think about, I think what Eric challenges us to do when he puts that out there is to say, maybe there's a lot of things that you can't see, that you're blind to, that other people can see that you can't. Right. And we are unwise when we don't bother to try to figure out what that is.
Yeah, it's a challenge for all of us, as we think about our independence, as we think about our ongoing project of evolving democracy and the work we have to do, that perspective and curiosity and this idea of we the people. Yeah. We, not I, that's right. A we. Mm-hmm. So, there's a shared conversation that we have to be better at having from a space of curiosity. And certainly we want to hear from folks who are listening. Let us know what you think.
Always.
The good, the bad, the ugly.
Yes.
And you can learn where to find us in the details in the show notes. And also just remember, leave a review.
Yeah. Very important.
Yes. So come back next time. We're excited to keep the conversation going. And hopefully this will help you, again, just think about the choices you're making day to day, and how in every choice there's an opportunity to start a ripple, for better or for worse. So let's make them good ripples wherever you are today. Thanks for joining us. Let us know your thoughts on this episode. Our email is in the show notes. You can listen anytime on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or visit holocaustandhumanity.org/podcast. You can also connect with us on Instagram and TikTok at Holocaust and Humanity, and X and Facebook at CincyHHC. The Upstander Ripple Effect is a production of the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanity Center. The center's mission is to ensure that the lessons of the Holocaust inspire action today. This series is part of the Cynthia and Harold Gutman Family Center for Storytelling. Visit us in person at Historic Union Terminal in Cincinnati, Ohio, or online anytime at holocaustandhumanity.org. Managing producer is Ann Thompson. Consulting producer is Joyce Kamen. Technical producer is Robert Mills, and technical director is Josh Emerson. The opening sequence is by Ken Furman. Select music is by Kick Lee, and this is recorded at Technical Consulting Partners Studios in Cincinnati, Ohio.